The morning I found my 60-year-old Virginia pine dying from the inside out, I had been watching it for 3 weeks without understanding what I was seeing. The needles had been browning from the interior branches outward, which was the opposite pattern of drought stress or disease, and the progression had been faster than any natural decline I had witnessed in 20 years of living with that tree. By the 3rd week, the lower third of the canopy was brown, and the upper section was thinning in a way that told anyone who knew trees that what was happening was not reversible. I called an arborist on a Thursday. He came Friday morning, walked around the tree twice, got close to the base, crouched down, and spent about 4 minutes examining the root flare and the soil immediately around it. Then he stood up and said, "Mr. Garrett, I need to ask you something directly." I said, "Go ahead." He said, "Have you or anyone you know applied any herbicide or soil treatment to the area around this tree in the past 60 days?" I said I had not. He said, "Has anyone else had access to this area?" I thought about that. The tree was in the back corner of my yard, near the fence line that separated my property from my neighbor's. The fence line, Margaret Holloway's fence line. I said, "What are you seeing?" He said, "The pattern of decline, the speed of progression, and the condition of the root zone soil are consistent with herbicide application at the base. I want to take a soil sample before I say anything more definitive." He took the soil sample. He sent it to a laboratory. The results came back the following Wednesday. Tricloper, a broadleaf and woody plant herbicide specifically formulated for killing trees and woody vegetation, present in the soil at the root flare of my 60-year-old Virginia pine at concentrations that the arborist, when he called to give me the results, described as intentional rather than incidental. He said this did not drift from a neighboring property. This was applied directly at the base of your tree. I sat with that for a moment. Then I said, "How long does a pine this size take to die from this concentration?" He said, "At this stage, it is already dying. The root system damage is irreversible. You have weeks, possibly a month. I am sorry." I thanked him. I hung up. I sat at my kitchen table and thought about Margaret Holloway and the 8 months of letters she had sent about my pine tree, and the 2 months since the last letter when she had apparently decided that letters were not producing the result she wanted. My name is David Garrett. I am 52 years old, environmental compliance officer for a regional manufacturing company, homeowner for 20 years on Sycamore Ridge Drive in a suburb outside of Raleigh, North Carolina, and the owner of a 60-year-old Virginia pine that my wife Helen and I had specifically selected this property for when we bought it, because the tree was magnificent and healthy and gave the backyard a scale and character that no planted tree could replicate in any reasonable time frame. Helen had died 4 years ago. The tree was the last thing on our property that had been old before we arrived. Margaret Holloway had moved in next door 3 years ago and had been on the Sycamore Ridge HOA board for 2 of those years, serving as the Architectural Standards Chair, a position that gave her authority over exterior modification requests and compliance determinations. She was in her late 50s, meticulous about her property, and had a particular sensitivity to anything that affected the light reaching her backyard garden. My pine tree affected the light reaching her backyard garden. The first letter had arrived 14 months ago. It cited the HOA's tree management standards, which required that trees producing significant shade impact on neighboring properties be subject to trimming or reduction under certain conditions. The letter asked me to have the tree assessed by an HOA-approved arborist. I had the tree assessed. The HOA-approved arborist produced a report saying the tree was healthy, structurally sound, and that significant trimming to reduce shade impact would compromise the tree's structural integrity and health. Margaret had sent a second letter disputing the arborist's conclusions. I had sent a response noting that the arborist was on the HOA's own approved list and that his conclusions were professional findings I had no basis to dispute. Margaret had sent a third letter asking the HOA board to require a second assessment. The board had declined on the basis that the first assessment had been conducted by an approved professional and had reached a clear conclusion. Margaret had sent letters 4 through 9 over the following 8 months, each one finding a new angle. The tree created a debris hazard. The root system was approaching her foundation. The aesthetic impact on her property value was significant. The HOA's shade standards had not been properly applied. Each letter I had addressed through the HOA process, and each one the board had declined to act on. The last letter had arrived 2 months ago. It had been angrier than the others. It had said that the board's failure to address the tree was creating an unreasonable burden on her property and that she intended to explore other options. Other options. I had filed that letter with the others and thought it was frustration expressing itself. It was not frustration expressing itself. It was a statement of intent. I called my attorney the afternoon the arborist called with the laboratory results. My attorney was a woman named Patricia Cole who had handled my property matters for 12 years and who answered my call on the second ring. I told her what the laboratory had found. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Tricloper applied at the root flare of a 60-year-old tree." I said, "At concentrations the arborist described as intentional." She said, "David, this is not a property dispute anymore." I said, "I know." She said, "Tricloper is a regulated herbicide under North Carolina environmental law. Intentional application to kill a tree on a neighboring property is a criminal matter in addition to a civil one." I said, "I know that too." She said, "And given your professional background?" I said, "I work in environmental compliance. I know exactly what Tricloper is and what the regulatory framework around it looks like." She said, "Who do you think did this?" I said, "I think I know. I need the evidence to say it conclusively." She said, "What evidence do you have?" I told her what I had: the arborist's report, the laboratory results, the chain of letters from Margaret, the timeline showing the tree's decline beginning approximately 6 to 8 weeks after Margaret's last letter. She said, "The timeline is circumstantial, but it is suggestive." I said, "I also have security cameras." She said, "On the tree?" I said, "On the back fence line." I installed them 2 years ago after a property line dispute with a different neighbor. They cover the full eastern fence line and the back corner where the tree stands. She said, "David." I said, "I have not reviewed the footage yet. I wanted to call you first." She said, "Pull the footage right now and do not touch anything near the tree until I tell you otherwise." I pulled the footage. The system kept 60 days of rolling backup. I went to the footage from 6 weeks prior, which was within the window the arborist had estimated for the herbicide application based on the decline pattern. On a Tuesday evening 6 weeks ago, at 7:43 in the evening, in the dim light of dusk, a figure had come through the gate in Margaret Holloway's fence, walked to the base of my pine tree, crouched at the root flare for approximately 4 minutes, and returned to her property. The camera angle and the light quality were not sufficient to positively identify the face. But the figure was wearing a distinctive blue and white gardening apron that I had seen Margaret wearing on multiple occasions when she was working in her yard. And they were carrying a small backpack sprayer of the type used for targeted herbicide application. I called Patricia back. I said, "The footage shows a figure at the base of my tree 6 weeks ago carrying a backpack sprayer. The figure is wearing what appears to be a distinctive gardening apron consistent with one I have observed my neighbor wearing." Patricia said, "Save everything to a separate drive immediately, multiple copies." I saved 3 copies on 3 separate drives. She said, "Do not contact Margaret. Do not contact the HOA. Do not post anything publicly." I said, "Understood." She said, I am going to make 2 calls this afternoon. The first is to the North Carolina Department of Agriculture and Consumer Services, which regulates herbicide use. The second is to the North Carolina Department of Environmental Quality. I said, DAQ. She said, you work in environmental compliance. You know why DAQ? I said, trichlopper is water-soluble. Depending on soil conditions and proximity to the drainage system, there may be a groundwater or stormwater pathway issue. She said, what is the drainage situation at your tree's location? I said, the back corner drains to a swale that connects to the neighborhood stormwater system. She said, which connects to? I said, Walnut Creek. It is a tributary of the Neuse River Basin. Patricia was quiet for a moment. She said, David, the Neuse River Basin is a protected watershed under the Neuse River Basin nutrient-sensitive waters rules. Pesticide discharge into a stormwater system connected to a Neuse Basin tributary is a serious environmental violation. I said, I am aware of that. She said, the concentration levels in your soil sample. I said, the arborist described them as high enough to be intentional rather than incidental. She said, high enough to potentially leach. I said, depending on rainfall events in the past 6 weeks, yes, potentially. She said, I am making those calls now. That was the end of part 1. My tree was dying. My camera had footage of a figure at its base 6 weeks ago. My soil had trichlopper at concentrations high enough to have entered the stormwater system. And Patricia was calling the regulatory agencies whose authority over this situation made the HOA's letters look like what they were, which was a footnote to something considerably larger. Part 2 is where the investigation arrived in a way that Margaret Holloway had not considered when she decided that letters were not producing results fast enough. The North Carolina Department of Agriculture and Consumer Services investigator called me on Monday morning. Her name was Investigator Sandra Webb, and she had been with the Pesticide Regulation Division for 11 years. She was direct and specific in the way that regulatory investigators are direct when they have reviewed a complaint and determined it warrants their attention. She said, Mr. Garrett, I have reviewed the complaint your attorney filed on Friday and the attached laboratory results. I want to ask you some questions about the situation. I answered her questions for 40 minutes. She asked about the timeline of the tree's decline. She asked about the laboratory's chain of custody for the soil sample. She asked about the arborist's qualifications and the basis for his conclusions about intentional application. She asked about the security camera system and the footage. At the end, she said, I am going to need the camera footage, and I am going to need to access your property to collect additional soil samples. I said, when can you come? She said, Wednesday. She came Wednesday with a colleague and spent 3 hours on my property. They collected soil samples from 4 locations around the tree's root zone, from the drainage swale at the back of the property, and from a point 20 feet up the swale toward the street. They photographed the tree's condition extensively. They examined the fence line and the gate in Margaret's fence. Sandra said, the gate, is that gate on your property or hers? I said, the gate is in her fence on her property line. It provides access to a shared utility easement behind both properties. She said, so a person coming through that gate from her property would be entering the utility easement and would then need to cross onto your property to reach the tree. I said, the tree is approximately 12 feet inside my property line from the easement. She said, 12 feet inside your property. I said, yes. She said, so whoever applied the herbicide was on your property, not on the easement. I said, that is correct. She said, Mr. Garrett, I want to be direct with you about something. I said, go ahead. She said, the camera footage your attorney provided shows a figure entering from the gate and traveling 12 feet onto your property with application equipment. Combined with the laboratory results showing tricloper at the root flare, this is a serious matter. Unlicensed pesticide application to property you do not own is a violation of North Carolina pesticide law. Application in proximity to a stormwater system connected to a protected watershed is a separate violation under environmental law, and trespass onto private property to conduct that application is a criminal matter. I said, I understand all of those layers. She said, I am coordinating with the North Carolina Department of Environmental Quality. Their Stormwater Enforcement Division is going to want to test the swale and the downstream connection. I said, I expected that. She said, how long have you worked in environmental compliance? I said, 22 years. She said, then you know what the Neuse Basin watershed protection rules look like. I said, I do. She said, I want you to know that we are taking this seriously. The DEQ investigator, a man named Robert Ash, came the following Friday. He tested the drainage swale and the stormwater inlet at the street. He took water samples from the nearest downstream monitoring point on Walnut Creek. He came back to where I was standing by the tree and said, the swale sample is showing tricloper above background levels. The stormwater inlet sample is borderline. The Walnut Creek sample will take longer to process. I said, the rainfall events. He said, we had 2 significant rain events in the past 6 weeks. If the application was 6 weeks ago and the soil concentration was as high as your sample indicated, there is a reasonable probability that some leaching occurred. I said, what does that mean for the investigation? He said, it means this is not just a pesticide application violation. If we confirm tricloper in the watershed tributary, this becomes a discharge violation under the water quality standards for the Neuse Basin. He said, do you know who did this? I said, I have evidence pointing toward a specific individual. I have provided that evidence to your colleague at DACS and to my attorney. He said, I am going to need to speak with that individual. I said, I expected that. Margaret Holloway received a visit from 2 investigators, Sandra Webb from DACS and Robert Ash from DEQ, the following Tuesday. I know because Sandra called me afterward. She said, Mr. Garrett, I want to update you on the status of the investigation. I said I appreciated that. She said, we spoke with your neighbor this morning. She initially denied any involvement. When we described the camera footage and the laboratory results and the specific characteristics of the herbicide found in your soil, her denial became qualified. I said, qualified how? She said she had applied a vegetation management product near the fence line on her own property and that any migration to your property was unintentional. I said the application point was 12 feet inside my property line. She said I pointed that out to her. She then said she may have crossed the line unintentionally in the dark. I said at 7:43 in the evening in dusk conditions with a backpack sprayer. She said I pointed that out as well. She said, Mr. Garrett, I am going to be honest with you about where this goes from here. We are going to issue a formal notice of violation to your neighbor for unlicensed pesticide application on property she did not own. That is a civil penalty matter. Depending on the Walnut Creek sample results, DEQ may issue a separate notice of violation for stormwater discharge. The trespass element is a matter for the Wake County Sheriff's Office, which I have referred the camera footage and my interview notes to. I said, what are the civil penalty ranges? She said pesticide application violations under North Carolina law carry civil penalties up to $5,000 per violation. If DEQ confirms watershed discharge, their penalties are separate and can be significantly higher depending on the nature and extent of the discharge. I said, and my tree? She said, your arborist has documented that the damage is irreversible. That is a civil damages matter between you and your neighbor. I can tell you that our investigation has produced findings that will support your civil case significantly. I said, I appreciate your thoroughness. She said, Mr. Garrett, in 11 years of pesticide investigation work, this is the most thoroughly documented private herbicide application case I have worked. Your soil sampling was timely, your chain of custody was correct, your camera footage was preserved properly, and your professional background means you understood the regulatory dimensions from the beginning. I said, 22 years of environmental compliance work. She said, it shows. Patricia filed the civil complaint the following week. It named Margaret Holloway personally for trespass, intentional destruction of private property, the specific destruction of a 60-year-old Virginia pine tree valued by a certified arborist at $38,000 as a mature specimen of that age and size, and negligent discharge of a regulated pesticide into a stormwater system. $38,000. The arborist's valuation had considered the tree's age, its species, its size, its condition prior to the herbicide application, and the replacement cost analysis showing that no replacement tree could reach equivalent size in any reasonable timeframe. Margaret retained an attorney within the week. Her attorney was a man named Charles Morton, who called Patricia within 2 days of service. He said his client maintained that the herbicide application had been on her own property and that any migration was unintentional. Patricia said the camera footage showed the application point as 12 feet inside my property line, that the DACS investigator had measured the distance as part of the official investigation, and that the official investigation had produced findings inconsistent with his client's account. He said his client disputed the camera footage interpretation. Patricia said the DACS investigator's formal interview notes documented her client's statement that she may have crossed the line unintentionally in the dark, which she said was an inconsistency with disputing the footage. Charles said his client's statement had been made under pressure and without counsel. Patricia said the statement was in an official investigative record and was not going to disappear. He said his client was prepared to discuss resolution. Patricia said resolution required acknowledgement of the conduct, full payment of the $38,000 tree valuation, payment for all related legal and investigative costs, and a written commitment to no further property interference. He said $38,000 was significant. Patricia said a 60-year-old Virginia pine was significant. He called back in 3 days. The DACS notice of violation had arrived at Margaret's address in the interim. The civil penalty was $4,200 for unlicensed pesticide application on property she did not own. A second notice of violation from DEQ arrived 2 days later. The Walnut Creek sample had confirmed trichlopper above background levels. DEQ's civil penalty for the stormwater discharge violation was $11,000. Charles called Patricia the day after the DEQ notice arrived. He said his client's position had evolved. Patricia said she imagined it had. The Wake County Sheriff's Office had also, by this point, reviewed the DACS interview notes and the camera footage and had opened a criminal trespass investigation. A deputy had contacted me for a statement. I had provided the statement and the full documentation. Charles said his client wanted to resolve all matters simultaneously. Patricia said the civil matter was hers to negotiate. The regulatory penalties were between his client and the state agencies. The criminal matter was between his client and the sheriff's office. He said, what would comprehensive civil resolution look like? Patricia said the same thing she had said before: the tree valuation, the legal costs, the investigative costs I had incurred, including the arborist and the laboratory, the written commitment. He said the total was significant given the regulatory penalties his client was also facing. Patricia said the tree was 60 years old and irreplaceable. He came back with a partial offer. Patricia declined it. He came back with a fuller offer that was still short of the tree valuation. Patricia declined it. He came back with a third offer covering the full tree valuation, all legal and investigative costs, and the written commitment. Patricia said yes. The settlement total was $44,800, covering the tree valuation, arborist costs, laboratory costs, and all legal fees from the date of the first arborist call. The regulatory penalties were separate. Margaret paid DACS and DEQ their combined $15,200 in civil penalties. The criminal trespass matter was resolved through a deferred prosecution agreement that required Margaret to complete community service hours, pay a separate criminal restitution amount, and have no contact with me or my property for 2 years. The HOA board, which had been receiving copies of the regulatory correspondence because the discharge investigation had included the neighborhood stormwater system, held an emergency meeting 3 weeks after the settlement. Gerald Morrison, who had by this point become familiar to me as the interim president in the previous story's universe, but who in this story was simply the HOA's vice president and the most procedurally careful member of the board, called me before the meeting. He said, "David, the board has been reviewing the situation, Margaret's board position." I said, "She is the Architectural Standards Chair." He said, "The board voted last week to remove her from the position pending the outcome of the investigations. The settlement and the regulatory penalties have been resolved. The board is now deciding whether her conduct is consistent with continued board membership." I said, "That is a board decision, and I will not tell you how to make it." He said, "I am calling because I want to know if you have any concerns you would like the board to consider." I said, "Gerald, my concern has always been the tree. The tree is gone. The settlement addresses the financial loss. What the board does with its membership is your governance responsibility, not mine." He said, "I appreciate that." He said, "For what it is worth, the board is united in believing that what happened was wrong and that it reflected a failure of judgment that is inconsistent with the standards we expect of board members." I said, "I appreciate you saying that." Margaret resigned from the board before the meeting where her removal would have been voted on. The pine tree was removed by an arborist crew on a Saturday in November. I watched them work from the back porch for most of the morning. The tree came down in sections, the crew working carefully and professionally, the wood going to a company that used salvaged timber for furniture. The arborist who had done the original assessment had connected me with them. He said it was the right thing to do with a tree that had been 60 years growing. I kept a cross-section of the main trunk. 60 rings. The tree had been growing for 60 years before I arrived on this property and for 20 years after. 80 years of growth, rings in a cross-section I keep on my bookshelf now. Helen would have kept it too. Patricia called me after the settlement closed. She said, "David, I want to say something." I said, "Go ahead." She said, "In 12 years of property law, I have worked cases involving tree disputes, herbicide damage, neighbor conflicts, HOA enforcement issues, and environmental violations. I have never worked a case where all of those things were combined and where the client had built the documentation foundation before he even knew he needed it." I said, "I work in environmental compliance. The documentation is reflexive." She said, "The soil sample was taken within a week of the arborist's first visit." I said, "I knew something was wrong. I wanted the record." She said, "The laboratory chain of custody was perfect." I said, "I know how laboratories work." She said, "The camera footage was preserved on 3 separate drives before you called me." I said, "I know what happens when single-copy evidence disappears." She said, "You knew the regulatory pathway before I did." I said, "Tricklopper in a Neuse Basin watershed. I knew what that meant." She said, "David." I said, "Patricia." She said, "I am sorry about the tree." I said, "So am I." She said, the cross-section, that was a good idea. I said, it was the arborist's idea. He is a good man. She said, 60 rings. I said, 60 rings. The backyard is different now. The corner where the pine stood is open in a way it was not for 20 years, and the light comes down differently in the afternoon. I have planted 3 things in the space: a native understory redbud, a serviceberry, and a sweet bay magnolia, none of which will reach the pine's scale in my lifetime, but all of which will be growing toward it. Helen had liked native plants. I like to think she would have approved of the selection. Here is what I will leave you with. Margaret Holloway spent 14 months writing letters that did not produce the result she wanted. Then she did something in the dark that she believed would solve her problem without consequences, because she believed no one was watching and no one would think to test the soil. She was wrong about the camera. She was wrong about the soil test. She was wrong about the regulatory framework. And she was wrong about what it meant to apply a regulated herbicide near a stormwater system connected to a protected watershed. Each of those mistakes was available to anyone who thought carefully about what they were doing before they did it. She did not think carefully. She was frustrated, and she reached for a solution that felt effective and private. Documentation is the answer to people who believe their actions are private. The camera records what happens. The soil holds what is applied to it. The laboratory identifies what the soil holds. The regulatory framework exists specifically to address what the laboratory finds. Know your soil, know your watershed. Know what is growing on your property and document its condition regularly, not just when something goes wrong, because the baseline documentation is what makes the change visible. And if something starts dying that should not be dying, call the arborist before you call anyone else. Because the arborist will tell you what the soil is holding. And the soil will tell you everything. Drop your thoughts below. If someone has damaged your trees, your landscaping, or your property through chemical means, tell me about it. And if you have a significant tree on your property, document its condition today with photographs and dated records. Because the documentation that protects it is the documentation you build before you need it. Start today. End of part 2, approximately 7,000 words. Thumbnail text. She poisoned my 60-year pine at night. The soil remembered everything.